Hi, and I hope you're doing okay. Our readings today come from John's Gospel as Jesus cleans out the temple in, well, anger, possibly rage. And then one of the vigorous images from the book of Revelation of God's wrath, God's anger, and the angels pouring out the bowls of God's wrath. We didn't have time to read them all, but you can do that for yourself. The seven bowls of God's wrath. I thought it would be a good time for us to ponder the wrath of God. Wrath's an interesting word. We don't use it very often. It's in a few film titles and book titles. It implies a very powerful surge of anger and normally would have the implication of a righteous anger, but a very powerful dynamite of overflowing desire to set things straight or something. Where do we start with the wrath of God? Very simply, where we always start, as Jesus has shown us the place to begin. God is love, and wrath is the direct result, or God's wrath. So we're going to use wrath in the rather biblical way, religious way, if you like, to refer to God's wrath. God's wrath, is a response of God's love. God is love. So, because God is love, God is creator and has generously, graciously created other being to exist. And in that act of grace called creation, that act of love called creation, God has also made space for life, and all life has a degree of freedom to it. That's a characteristic of life, and human life has moral freedom, ethical freedom, spiritual freedom, and freedom of choice. We call it free will. And this capacity in human beings to love alongside God with a love derived from God's own love, and to exercise free choice in pursuing that love and expressing that love. This the Bible calls at the beginning of Genesis the image of God. This is among the characteristics that we have as human beings, which is a reflection, an image. It's not the same thing. God's thoughts and our thoughts are not the same, but is a reflection of God's own being, God's own freedom, God's own morality and ethics and goodness, God's own choices, and particularly God's capacity to love. Well, talking of Genesis, and it never takes me long, or rarely takes me long, to go back into the first three chapters of Genesis when thinking anything through or sharing any thoughts about it. Let's go to the very first act of judgment in the Bible, and it is an act of judgment by the snake and the human beings, Eve and Adam, against God. Basically, humanity judges God to be less than God says God is. Okay, and therefore there's this act of judgment. If you look at the temptation, the snake says, but God's not really got your interests in mind. God is scared of you because you have the capacity to take some of God's place, and God is keeping you down, not lifting you up. And so the human perception is that God is bad news, a producer of rules, and therefore of limitations. And humanity makes the decision, and even Adam's decision, to judge that God is not as good as God claims to be. and then to set about human self-promotion over and against God. And the result is a distancing of the human beings from God. And so when God comes looking to hang out with them in the cool of the day, they hide away. How do we expect love to respond to anti-love? Love must be hurt by anti-love. It must be offended by any harm, by any hate, by any destruction. We could put it in other words. How do we expect the Creator to respond to anti-creation? Because that's what has occurred. God has created everything, looked at it all, said, well, this is really all very good. So it's declared to be good. It is morally excellent. God is pleased with it. Okay, but then even Adam, together with the snake, begin an anti-creation movement, an undoing of the goodness of the created order. They have acted anti-love, therefore anti-faith, anti-trust, anti-everything else, ultimately that is good. Love's reaction to anti-love, the Creator's reaction to anti-creation, the Bible often calls wrath, at least the English translations, and we'll just leave it at there for this week. Let's look at what made Jesus angry. This will help us, I think. So we notice that Jesus is angered by a pretend love for God and a pretend love for neighbour. So we find Jesus becoming very upset in the temple courts where the buying and selling was going on, just in the area where anybody from anywhere in the world was allowed to gather for prayer and for acts of devotion towards the God of Israel. And Jesus is incensed by the way some of his own people take over this space and turn it into a place for personal gain and profit. And Jesus drives them out, upsets the tables, and creates quite a scene. Because Jesus hated hypocrisy, loved people, but if you wanted to make Jesus angry, just be a hypocrite on love for God and on love for neighbour. We haven't got time to pursue the number of ways in which the Gospel show us Jesus encountering those hypocrisies, particularly in the Pharisees, but in lots of other people as well. But you can read the Gospel and you'll spot that with great ease, that nothing seems to have upset Jesus very much except the pretense of a love for God that wasn't real and the pretense of a love for neighbour that wasn't truly there. Anything, therefore, that is anti-love, unfair, unjust, and harmful. And so Jesus has a feelings reaction to it. And we shouldn't be surprised to think that God has a feelings reaction. How can God be love if God were unfeeling? And therefore wrath is a personal feeling, a personal response to anti-love. It's a personal response in God to anti-creation. So it's a feeling, but it is also an urge to restore and repair. And therefore, God brings into the scene restorative guidance in the law and the prophets for the ancient people of Israel, which are going to provide the platform into which Jesus would come and bring the New Testament and the good news of the gospel. So there's the restorative guidance to limit the damage and to help people at a particular juncture in the history of Israel and on up to the time of Christ. But ultimately, it has to be more than simply some guiding rules and even the guidance of the prophets. It has to be more than the law and the prophets. There has to be an overruling which really addresses the human will. Just as the story of Adam and Eve show us as human beings opting out of God's way of love. So we must be given the opportunity to opt back in. And Jesus brings that opportunity to us full on. Jesus shows us what God's love is like, tells us what God's love is like, teaches us, and ultimately surrenders himself to our destructive tendency and our hatred for the things of God and our anti-God response, which leads him to be nailed to the cross. God's wrath is love worked out in grace to guide, shepherd, restore, and bring about the healing of creation in the new order. The old prophet Habakkuk, one of the Bible prophet writers, almost at the end of the Old Testament, you can find Habakkuk in chapter 3 and verse 2, calls upon God in wrath, remember mercy. And this is definitely the characteristic of God's wrath. It is never without a remembering of mercy, which is why God's wrath is poured out to us in grace, because wrath and love are much the same thing. Love responds to hatred and destruction and harm with wrath. You do. If somebody sets about hurting somebody you love, or perhaps something that's very, very important to you, you will feel a righteous indignation and a response to that. Just as love can be hurt, so righteousness can be offended, and God's sovereignty can be rebelled against. And God has all these things to set right in order that the whole creation can be made right. The Bible's full of many intimidating and alarming tokens and symbols and signs and images of the wrath of God. All of them, of course, falling short of what it must surely be to be under the wrath of God were there no mercy, were the wrath without grace. Forgiveness would be meaningless if there's no reason for anger. You know how easy it is. You trip up over somebody's, bag left somewhere. You don't even fall to the ground. It's just a minor inconvenience. And they go, oh, sorry. And you go, oh, no problem. That forgiveness is so easy because there's no real cost. There's no really good reason for anger. But what if somebody really seriously harms a person who is precious to you? What if somebody really seriously harms what is important and what you know to be good? Then there is good reason for anger, and it is there that grace will shine in forgiveness. Forgiveness would be meaningless if it was just God going, that's okay, send them to the concentration camp, I'll just overlook it. Yes, fill your life with slavery, that's fine, we'll just forget about all that. No, of course there must be, for forgiveness to have any meaningful currency at all, there must be the wrath in the first place. And the good news of the gospel of Jesus is that God processes the wrath of God in his own suffering through Christ on the cross in our place, so that we are not left there, but we have it remaining to us, just as we opted out of God's loving ways to opt in to the love of God. And that's what following Jesus is all about. It's opting into the gracious love of God. Well, God bless you. I hope you have a good and safe week, and that all the troubles and trials that life can throw at you will be met as God's Spirit works in you a deep peace, a trust, and a true faith. God bless you and make you a blessing to others this week. Amen.